on observation. But also, these premises, or rather, this so these arguments, okay, or these statements, these premises should be true. There has to be a standard of by which the arguments flow. We cannot begin arguments on a relative basis where we say whatever you're saying is true to you and whatever I'm saying is true to me. There has to be a standard truth, right? If this is white, we have first to believe or to agree that this is white. But the moment you begin to say this is black and I'm saying this is white, then we do not have a conversation. Why? Because there is no measure for who determines what color it is. So either one of us has a defect in their eye, or both of us have defects in our eyes. So, and I think for us as apologists, or who are learning it to do apologetics, we have to be open when skeptics begin conversations and push us towards a logical flow of thinking. Let us be honest and carry along. If we lose, it's fine, right? But truth is what we have, and truth is what they do not have. And so if we can maximize on truth that exists and is knowable and observable, then we can easily win arguments. But remember again, our goal is not necessarily just to win an argument. Our goal is to finally proclaim the gospel to these people. Let's now dive into the question of the existence of God. Now, I have to say that the existence of God is not a conclusion to be reached so much as a given to be assumed. The fact that we are here spending the next 1 hour making cases or arguments for the existence of God is really so we can be armed to accommodate conversations with skeptics. But at the heart of the matter, we know that the existence of God is not a conclusion that must be reached, but this is a truth that is already assumed. The Bible does not begin by explaining the cosmology of God. The Bible simply begins by saying, in the beginning, God. After all, that's how the Bible begins. And so we already know that God did not need to explain himself to creation. As human beings, we all have an innate idea of God, a sense of the divine that leaves us without excuse, right? Romans 1, 19 to 20, allow me to read. Romans 1, 19 to 20 says, Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Acts 17, 24 to 28. Turn there, Acts 17, 24 to 28 says, The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. Verse 26, From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out the appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. So that we can conclude just like the wise man in Psalms, only the fool says in his heart, there is no God. God's existence is the starting place for human knowledge, not the end point of human deduction. So that if, as we continue to converse with a skeptic, we are not on a journey, both of us trying to unravel something. No, the mystery has already been revealed that God does exist. It is only that they are blind in their eyes. It's only that their ears are dull to hear. It is only that their hearts are dead and they need life. Genesis 1 verse 1 again says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Of course, now, if we have concluded that we do not necessarily need arguments to prove the existence of God, what about philosophical arguments? Now, please do not mistake what I said. This does not mean, however, that arguments for the existence of God are necessarily misguided. One can argue for the existence of God in a way that is subservient to human reason, or in a way that supports divine revelation. We are not arguing away the need for philosophical arguments. We are just saying these philosophical arguments come in as maidens, okay? They come in as handmaids to the reality of divine revelation. One of the longest historical apologists of all time, Thomas Aquinas, modeled this. He was trying to model how to use arguments, and when he began his discourse, he did not begin from philosophy, he began from scripture. And he begins his discussion in Exodus 3:14, I am who I am. And then after he explains that God does not need to be explained, or God does not need an explanation or a proof, he goes ahead to pen down 5 ways of arguing for the existence of God, which we will look at a later stage. But at this point, allow me just to mention them by passing. First argument says, it's an argument from motion. It says, there cannot be an infinite regression of motion. Someone or something must have absolute actuality, an unmovable mover. We cannot just have a regress of motion. There has to be one who moved first. There has to be one who began the moving. He also talked about the argument from nature, or efficient causation. He says cause and effect must have begun with some first cause. Cause and effect are not infinite in their nature. He also talked about the argument from possibility and necessity. He says existence cannot come from non-existence. Something must exist of its own necessity, not as a mere probability. And the fourth argument says argument from gradation, right? Something must be most good, most perfect, and most true. A supreme being from which all degrees of lesser perfection are determined. And the last view that he gave is argument from the governance of the world. He says some intelligent being must exist by whom all natural things are directed to their appointed ends. But really what I want to say about Thomas Aquinas is all these arguments he was putting together were not just arguments from nowhere. He began by explaining that when God was even revealing himself to Moses, he says, I am who I am. Basically, God is saying, I do not need to introduce myself. I do not need to explain myself. I do not need to prove myself. So then, why ask this question? Why ask the question of why do we need philosophical arguments? First of all, I think we should ask the question of whether God exists because it's a good question. We should ask the question of the existence of God because it's a real question that people have. The way a person answers this question affects a person's answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? If God is not real, life has no real meaning. So this is not a question to push away, right? Because if God does exist, then life has meaning and purpose. But if God does not exist, then life does not have meaning, life does not have purpose. If there is no God, you, me, everything is a result of matter, time, and chance. We are just bubbles, right? Or we are dust. We are meaningless in a sense. There is no standard for morality and things like that. If there is no God, at the end of your life, you won't exist, and nothing you did in life really matters. If there is no God, there is no justice for the injustices that we have continued to see in the world. If there is no God, there is no ultimate hope for no one, and no one has to live expecting anything from the coming future. So what are we saying here? Helping someone think through this question can help them move closer to a belief in God. And if they do not if they do not move to closely a belief to God, they will at least move to an idea of the dignity of man and the meaning of life. So there are only two possibilities in a good answer. We are saying these questions are important because they have a relationship to life. We're saying these questions are important because they are good questions. Right? It is a good question. If God is not real, life has no real meaning. But you know what? There is a good answer. If God is real, life has real meaning. If God does exist, then life has meaning and purpose and value. We are not just accidents of time, space, and matter, right? The world is not all there is. The Bible says in Psalms 19 verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the works of his hands. And you could almost say that's the end of it. Like, let's just wrap it up and go home. But then we can form our arguments in a more simpler way, right? So there is these three arguments. The first one is the argument of the existence of the universe. The other one is the argument of the existence of design in the universe. And the other one, you could talk about morality, where you say the existence of objective moral values. And this could be a way to begin, okay? The first one is normally by philosophers called the cosmological argument. The second one, the existence of design, is majorly ontological in nature or teleological. And the third one is really the argument from morality. So we're going to just look at these three, and hopefully we'll be done with our class. Let's look at the argument based on the existence of the universe. The big idea here is that God is the best explanation for why the universe exists. God is the best explanation for why the universe exists. The first part of the argument goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. We all agree with that, right? Scientifically, using observation, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Then we'll say the universe began to exist. The universe began to exist. Then what do we conclude? So we know the universe has a cause. And because we know the universe has a cause, we are confident to say there has to be a first cause that started it all. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause. There has to be a first cause that started it all. But this first cause, how should it look like? What should be the characteristics of this first cause? the first cause itself has to be uncaused. Because if it is caused, then that's not the cause. Right? Yeah? It also has to be timeless. That means the cause should not be limited to time, space, or matter. It also should not be a physical kind of thing, because if it is a physical kind of thing, then it is subject to the laws of nature, and in itself is matter. Okay? So then we can conclude logically that God is the best explanation for things that look designed. No, sorry. So we can conclude that this first cause that is uncaused, that is timeless, that is not a physical kind of thing is God, because there has never been any other thing outside God that has and fits this description. Okay? Whatever began to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. That means the universe has a cause. And if this cause does exist, then the cause has to be uncaused, has to be timeless, is not supposed to be constrained by time, space, and matter. And that means the cause is not physical. And if the cause is not physical, then for us, we are saying the cause is God. There has not been another explanation given philosophically for such a cause. When you look at Darwinianism, when you look at the Big Bang Theory and all the other theories that are given, they do not lead to a first cause. They just say these things happened randomly and motionlessly and things like that. But they do not go back to the first mover, or rather the first cause. So that's the argument based on the existence of the universe. The first argument. The second argument is an argument based on design that is seen in the universe. The complexity and the beauty of the design that is seen in the universe explains to us the existence of God. The complexity, for example, of the human being, the DNA and everything that is there. We can conclude that God is the best explanation for things that look designed in the world. Example, the DNA. I don't know, I forgot the DNA. I forgot how it is. This is an abbreviation, right? But when you study science further, you realize that the human being is a very complex kind of being. That so much so that evolution in itself cannot explain such complexity. Chance and randomness cannot explain such complexity. Not only is the human being complex in his nature biologically, but is also complex because human beings are able to come up with ideas and thoughts and values, and they are able to teach, and they are able to condition behavior and things like that. The order of this nucleotide bases works just like a secret code or the letters in a book. And the way it is done, it's such a way that if, for example, if you're an IT person, someone must have coded it. Someone must have put it together. Romans 2:15 says, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Who wrote these requirements on their hearts? Why does human beings have a conscience, for example? Why do we have such a high value system? The complexity of the nature of the earth, not just the human person, even just the way the landscapes and everything, cannot have an explanation outside God, outside one who is beyond and is not limited to the laws of gravity, for example, such that in his grandness he decides and he orchestrates complexity and brings out beauty in it. so that the universe itself declares the glories of one who is beyond it, of one who is not contained by it. And this is what you would call the teleological argument, or, I mean, if you want to be complex in your language or anything, but it's basically just argument based on design, right? But there's also the argument based on non-objective moral values. And here we say that God is the best explanation for objective moral values. What do we mean by the name or the word objective? As an adjective, the word objective basically means existing independently or of perception, existing independently of perception, or an individual's conceptions. That means these values exist independent of how we perceive them or independent of how we conceptualize them. So the question then would be then, are there objective moral values? We could say that moral laws have an oughtness to them. They have an independence of as a type of nature that in and of themselves, they do not need to be defined, right? For example, if I took out a machete and killed someone here, you would not sit back and say, it really depends on how I think about it. Maybe it's not a bad thing. No, there would be an immediate rush of saying, this is wrong. But then the question would be, who said it's wrong? Right? And even for the skeptic, if you bring up the issue of killing children or innocent children or innocent mothers, they would say, this is wrong. And we know that many of these atheists have come up with ways of addressing injustices. And the simple question is to, first of all, agree with them that we acknowledge that you really have a sense of justice and a sense of appreciation for morality. But then the question would be, how do we explain it? Where does it come from? Very recently, Sam Harris came up with some kind of way of describing it. Not Sam Harris, I think Richard Dawkins said, morality is a social contract that human beings have come together to put in place as a way of survival. But then you would ask yourself the question, if survival in its nature and evolution is survival for it has the concept of survival for the fittest, if I eat all the food and my neighbor dies, right, because I needed the food to survive, how is that morality? How does that speak to the concept of social contracts or anything? So beyond it, we cannot conclude here and say and sympathize with Richard Dawkins by saying morality is a social contract. If morality was a social contract, then the contract must include the clause that says then all should survive. But at least from Darwinianism, the idea is that the fittest are the ones who survive. So the argument of morality being a social contract based off of evolution explaining away the existence of God loses from the point it is spoken out. Sorry. Before I can talk about morality being a product of intelligence, I want to say first that we should distinguish between moral values and duties. Values have to do with whether something is good or bad. But duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. Now, you might think at first that this is a distinction without a difference. Good and right mean the same thing, right? The same goes for bad and wrong. But if you think about it, you can see that this isn't the case. Duty has to do with a moral obligation, what you ought or ought not to do. That's why we said moral laws have an oughtness to them. But obviously, they are not morally obligated to do something just because it would be good for you to do it. For example, it would be good for you to become a doctor, but you're not morally obligated to become a doctor. After all, it would also be good for you to become a homemaker, for example, or a diplomat, for example, but you can't do them all. So there's a difference between good and bad and right and wrong. Good and bad has to do with something that's something's worth. Is it good? Is it bad? While right and wrong, or rather what we call duties, has to do with something being obligatory. The second thing I have to say is that there's a distinction between being objective or subjective. By being objective, I mean I am independent of my own. It means something being objective, it means this thing is independent of people's opinions or people's perceptions or people's conceptions. So to say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or bad independent of whatever people think about it. Similarly, to say that we have objective moral duties is to say that certain actions are right or wrong for us regardless of what people think about it. So, and it begs the question, where do these moral values come from? These moral values imply, right, that there is an existence of a moral lawgiver. They could be products of intelligence. But intelligence is very relative in its nature. Everybody has a different level of intelligence. And so my level of intelligence could tell me that killing is right. But your level of intelligence could tell you that killing is wrong. Is there a basis? So this is how we would put the argument, okay? If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Right? But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Simple as that. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And so, of course, there is this thing called the Euthyphro argument that says, is something good because God wills it? Or does God will something because it is good? It's a very confusing question, right? But it doesn't really, it's not really up to us to decide which is which, right? All we know is that God does exist. God has defined moral values and duties. And because God has defined moral values and duties, thus explains his own existence. I'm going to take a few minutes of our ending time here to look at Thomas Aquinas once again, just a little bit, and see his arguments, right? And before him, before Thomas Aquinas, we had other Greek philosophers, people like Plato and Aristotle and many others. Plato argued that God must be thought to exist because there is motion in the universe. Plato was a skeptic by nature, remember. He went on to argue that only a supreme being could originate such motion as is apparent in the universe. Aristotle, another philosopher, put weight to the argument when he argued that the type of motion that we see in the universe is spectacular, such that it must have been started off by a mover that is himself unmoved. And God is an unmoved mover. Around 1225 to 1274 AD, Thomas Aquinas comes on board named as the greatest scholastic theologian of the Middle Ages, he said to have argued to know in a general and confused way that God exists is implanted in us by nature. That was his beginning point. And then he said, everything that happens has a cause, and this cause in turn has a cause, and so on in a series that has to stop until it stops at the first cause. And there are so many other theologians who came later on and argued for the existence of God. My encouragement to us today is that we can explain God, but we cannot explain him fully. Our explanations will not save anyone, but we need to start somewhere. We can start by arguing for the existence of God based on morality. We can start by arguing for the existence of God based on design. We can also start arguing for the existence of God based on the beginning, cosmology. Because of time, we will not be able to cover the 5 ways in which Aquinas explained the existence of God. But the notes will be sent to us at some point so that we can go through them, and or hopefully we can start by recapping from next class. Allow me to pray so that we can bring this to conclusion. And then if you have any questions, you can talk to me after this as we get ready for the service. Heavenly Father, we are grateful that you have given us minds that can think. You have given us hearts that can feel. You have granted us new life, and you have put worship in our hearts for you, Lord. But we also grieve in the fact that we have brothers and sisters and friends who still do not believe in you, whose hearts are callous, dead, whose eyes are blind, Lord. Would you use us in the minimal ways that you can to bring the gospel to them? Even in our conversations that mostly would be philosophical, would you help us to ask the right questions so that these people can come to an understanding of the gospel and even to faith? We ask these things believing and trusting in your name. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for coming. May the Lord bless you all. If you have any questions, just please feel free to have a conversation with me. Thank you.